North Korea sounding off after a fresh round of sanctions from the UN Security Council in response to its missile launch late last month. The new sanctions limiting Pyongyang's access to oil and forcing North Korean workers in other countries to return home. The rogue regime calling the sanctions a, quote, act of war and threatening to retaliate against nations who supported them. Joining now is Kieran Skinner, professor of international relations at Carnegie Mellon University, a research fellow at Hoover Institution, and a Fox News foreign policy analyst. Nice to see you.
Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for being here. You know, North Korea seems to call everything an act of war. Every single time we do joint military exercises with South Korea, North Korea calls it an act of war. So, you know, why does Kim Jong-un do this, and at what point are we going to take it seriously?
Well, the newest sanctions are so dauntingly punitive that I think there's nothing else for the North Korean leader to say. Not only are they punitive, but they are unanimous, with much of the world behind the U.S.-led sanctions resolution. And that further isolates the regime. And it will hurt its economy and the ability of the leadership to continue to develop its nuclear and ballistic missile program. So his rhetoric doesn't compare to the reality of what the world has just done.
You know, North Korea also has vowed that every country that voted in favor of the resolution would face retaliation from North Korea. So presumably that would mean Russia and China. What do you make of that?
North Korea is out of options in terms of retaliation because it attempts to play nuclear blackmail. The problem with using that type of lack of diplomacy, if you will, is that you have no other options below. What can it do to the world but threaten some type of nuclear maneuver that would immediately hurt the Chinese, of which it is attached to territorially. So I think it's just really rhetoric and desperation.
Well, how do you think these sanctions will actually be implemented? Because in the past, the problem is the sanctions haven't been implemented as they were supposed to be by the countries involved.
The fact that we've had numerous now unanimous sanctions resolutions and that the United States is continuing to pressure the great powers that have signed on to the sanctions resolutions like the Chinese and Russians, and given that the fact that the Chinese and Russians are part of the sanctions resolutions, they are the only allies of North Korea, I think speaks to the capacity to get a much more universal compliance with them. But also they hit so many sectors all at the same time that I think their effectiveness will be much superior to ones in the past. Textiles, for example, are now banned. The importing of North Korean textiles. The North Korean workers, more than 90,000, are being recalled home from abroad within 2 years, and they've accounted for additional hard currency for the country. You just go down the list, and I think these sanctions really will work.
That's true, and yet today the AP is reporting that U.S. officials say that, you know, when North Korean coal exports were forbidden, shiploads would basically be channeled through Russia. Sometimes goods and products would be switched from ship to ship out at sea in order to avoid sanctions being implemented.
Yes, there's more ship-to-ship compliance, I think, in the newest round of sanctions because there are ways to check for compliance that didn't exist in the past. But also, the Russians and Chinese simply have much more skin in the game this time because North Korea is so out of control with the development of its nuclear program against prior UN resolutions that the Chinese and the Russians have really taken notice. They don't want an all-out war. It will be devastating for them in addition to the rest of the world.
Well, I should mention that China actually has a defense agreement with North Korea, so it's sort of to be determined what would happen if North Korea were to get into a military action with another country, including the U.S. But I want to bring this up. You know, there's a thought that Kim Jong-un is absolutely unwilling to give up his nuclear program, that he essentially ties that to his own life and to his own staying in power, that he believes that Colonel Gaddafi would still be in place, that Hussein would still be alive if they had nuclear weapons. What do you say to that ideology, that he simply isn't going to give up his nuclear weapons program?
Yes, he's created this dangerous scenario where his regime survival and his own personal survival is tied to his nuclear program. This is an odd type of nuclear deterrence. The problem is that he's got to be able to continually convince the elites in his own country that the whole country's survival is tied to his survival, which is tied to the nuclear program. If there's any break away from him among elites, those in the military, those in China that he depends on, I think then he's taken a risky gambit, and it may not work.
All right, well, we shall see. Kyron Skinner, thank you for your insight today.
Thank you.